Good evening. Welcome. My name is Andrew Torrance, and I'm one of the organisers of these lectures alongside Professor Eric Priest and Professor Judith Wolfe. I should also add that these lecture series are sponsored by a generous grant from the Blankenmeyer Foundation and the John Templeton Foundation. Before introducing our evening's speaker, let me mention that our next lecture will be from Professor Jeff Schloss in October on the question, does evolution lead to love? You'll be able to find out more about this lecture and other lectures on our website. One more thing, you'll have noticed there are some surveys out and about, so if you're able to fill one out, and then at the end of the lecture, just leave it down here at the front, that would be enormously appreciated. Now to this evening's speaker. Professor Patrick Smith is Associate Research Professor of Theological Ethics and Bioethics at Duke Divinity School, and he is also a Senior Fellow in the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. He serves on the Board of Directors for the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities and is a recipient of the 2019 Paul Ramsey Award for Excellence in Bioethics. He has worked as Ethics Coordinator for Angela Hospice Care Centre, served on the Ethics Advisory Council for the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organisation, and he was a member of the Boston Children's Hospital Ethics Committee. Admirably, Professor Smith has also been actively involved in community development, supporting local communities in the building of affordable housing, engaging in advocacy work, and providing education on housing policies and practices. On top of all of this, he has also got 2 books forthcoming. The first of these is on the topic of tonight's lecture, titled Valuing Human Life at the End of Life, Theological Ethics and Hospice Palliative Care. The second is titled Shalom Ethics and the Struggle for Justice, Towards a Christian Social Ethic. So you'll no doubt want to keep an eye out for both of these. So it is an enormous privilege and a huge honour to welcome Professor Smith here this evening to present on Valuing Life at the End of Life. Welcome.
Good evening. It is an honor to be here, and special thanks to Professors Judith Wolfe, Professor Eric Priest, I think I saw him earlier, and also Professor Andrew Torrance for this invitation being here, and also to the very generous donors who make this event possible. I must admit that I feel a little like the mule whose owner entered him into the Kentucky Derby. When the registration was denied, one of the event planners said, "Why did you do such a foolish thing? You had to know that this mule couldn't win." And the owner of this mule said, "Well, I figured as much, but I thought the mere association could do him some good." And to be associated with the James Gregory lectures is really an honor for me. So tonight, Valuing Life at the End of Life. The way I want to begin here is just by thinking about this issue of medicalized dying. Some of you may know about the Hastings Center. There was Emeritus President Daniel Callahan, who's done work in bioethics over a number of years. In an article from a few years ago, this is what he wrote describing this idea of medicalized dying. So just bear with me here as I read a couple paragraphs from this article. He writes, "The American public must recognize some hard truths, most of which reflect some deep values of our kind of medicine and culture. The most important is that American medicine since the end of World War II has in effect declared a war on death, an unlimited pursuit of medical progress. To pursue that goal, it has supported medical research, nicely symbolized by the National Institutes of Health, with an annual budget of $30 billion to seek a cure for all the killer diseases, notably cancer, heart disease, stroke, kidney failure, and diabetes. The public, polls have shown over the years, fully supports that effort. The media have pitched in, reporting and touting the great promise and breakthroughs of the medical crusade. We now live some 8 years longer on average than we did 40 years ago. Death rates are declining for many diseases, and new technologies to keep us alive longer continue to flow forth. On the surface, those developments look good, but that story has taken an unexpected turn. The idea of an unlimited medical progress that admits of no upper boundaries is not turning out as hoped. We have not found, nor are we anywhere near finding, cures for the major killer diseases. What progress, in quotes he puts, has given us is an enhanced ability to keep sick people alive at a high cost financially and a no less high cost in terms of pain and suffering at the end of life. He goes on to say, more and more of our end-of-life care looks like the trench warfare of World War I. Heavier and heavier economic and human costs, with increasingly less ground being won. Another feature of the quest for unlimited progress is that technological advances have made it harder and harder to determine with any precision when a patient is actually dying. There's almost always something that can be done technologically to give a dying person a few more hours or days or even weeks before he or she actually dies. Now, this picture that Callahan paints for us in terms of medicalized dying and the current state of affairs surrounding death and dying is, I think, pretty close when you engage in this kind of work and see what happens at the end of life, especially in our hospitals. Perhaps we could quibble here or there that some of his statements may be a bit overstated. Even so, I'm inclined to think that they are not overstated by too much. Now, whatever our assessment of this description, it is certainly true, I want to suggest, that we do need to think carefully about care at the end of life. One of my colleagues used to say, yes, death and dying has, biological and physiological features to it, but it's also a spiritual experience as well. And as I'm working from within, broadly speaking, a Christian tradition that's informed by kind of African-American Christian experience, I do want to put that as part of the conversation of this idea of valuing life at the end of life and some of the theological resources that I try to draw in and wrestling with and thinking about these issues here. And I think Christian ethics, again, this is the tradition that I'm working from within, requires that we care for the dying and we should value human life regardless of the condition that the person may find her or himself in. So the question that we have before us is, what does it mean to value life at the end of life? What does it mean to value life at the end of life? I want to identify three schools of thought here following John Keown, Georgetown University. Some of you may be familiar with his work in this setting. He has these three schools of thought concerning the valuation of human life. And those three categories would be medical vitalism, quality of life, and the sanctity, or some would say the inviolability of life. The first view, this medical vitalist view, holds broadly that human life is an absolute moral value. Because of its absolute worth, according to this particular view, it is wrong either to shorten the life of a patient or to fail to strive to lengthen it, whether the life be that of a seriously disabled newborn baby or an elderly woman with advanced dementia. Vitalism prohibits its shortening and requires its ongoing preservation, regardless of the pain, suffering, or expense that life-prolonging treatment entails. John Keown notes it must be administered according to this particular view, this medical vitalist view. So it requires that human life be preserved at all cost. And so I want to suggest, with some of the points that I'll bring out a little bit later this evening, that a view such as this is in some tension with a Christian ethic, at least with the resources that I want to draw from in framing and thinking about this. I want to suggest that vitalism is often thought to be what is meant or entailed by the notion of the sanctity or the inviolability of life. And this often comes up in debates in various contexts where oftentimes those who would affirm of inviolability or sanctity of life often are pegged with an understanding or an idea of kind of medical vitalism. I want to say that we should, those who are thinking about these issues theologically would want to push back from that, from reasons which I hope will be a little bit clearer as we proceed this evening. Another view is this quality of life view. And so I want to have this kind of as a capital Q quality of life view. because again, I will want to make a qualification a little bit later about how quality of life language might be understood and at the end of the day may be helpful for us. But this quality of life view is not concerned only with assessing the worthwhileness of the treatment, but also the worthwhileness of the patient's life. So it holds that the lives of certain patients fall below a particular quality threshold, whether because of disease, injury, or disability. This valuation of human life grounds the principle that because certain lives are, say, not worth living, it is not wrong intentionally to end those lives under certain prescribed circumstances, whether it be by some type of act or deliberate omission with the intention of ending that particular life. Some who subscribe to this doctrine would require the patient's request as a precondition of termination on the ground that only the patient is in a position to maybe judge whether or not her or his life is worth living. Others perhaps would not require this, but this is this kind of larger quality, capital Q, quality of life view that sometimes comes up in these conversations. And also based on some of the theological resources that I want to appeal to, broadly speaking, this evening, this particular view is also in some tension with a Christian ethic, again, as being developed here in this context. Then lastly, there's this notion of the sanctity or the inviolability of life. In a way, I think this view, properly understood, can stand between the two extremes of the medical violence view on one hand and this kind of capital Q quality of life on the other hand. It is what is commonly called the doctrine of the inviolability or sanctity of life, and it certainly has religious connotations, as we know, in a space like this. And many religious ethicists have made appeal to it in developing their ethical systems, though the principle has also been articulated in non-religious terms by using something like inviolability, okay? So those who may subscribe, maybe the few folks who still subscribe to some form of metaphysical personalism, philosophical system, would draw resources from that philosophical system to think about it in that way. Certainly the Judeo-Christian tradition with this idea of the image of God certainly can be used to inform what it means to think about the sanctity or the inviolability of life, while acknowledging that people are leveraging these theological resources oftentimes for different ends. And many would point to how political philosophy talks about this principle of equal regard, right, with respect to human beings. So this whole idea of sanctity and inviolability of life shows up in religious ways and certainly non-religious ways as well here. And so my claim, again, that this way of viewing human life or the value of human life is probably the most consistent with the way I think about issues of death and dying theologically. And it requires wisdom to live out, right, to kind of navigate the poles in many respects. As I've done work in clinical spaces, issues of home care, talking with people in various ecclesial spaces, one of the things I recognize, and many of you who also have these experiences recognize that these issues are very complex, right? And while we do have some convictions perhaps, we also recognize that we need wisdom to make wise or to make good and credible decisions as we think carefully about what it means to value life at the end of life here. So let me just begin with highlighting just some broad and perhaps too broad theological resources, because I want to unpack this idea of the sanctity of life in the context of palliative care and this broad theological framework that we have here. So the first point that I want to raise here is that death is both friend and foe. Death is both friend and foe, or an enemy, but it's a defeated foe, okay? Now, again, some of my dear, good Reformed friends may not like the language of death as friend, and I certainly acknowledge that, but I do think there's this interesting kind of parallel that some ethicists have brought out, this kind of turn of phrase that gets at something very important, that affirming that death is kind of a foe friend and foe, or foe but a defeated enemy, or a defeated foe, so to speak here. So according to an understanding of the biblical narrative, it sees death as unnatural, inevitable, and for the Christian, not final. Okay? The biblical narrative does give us a picture where we see death as a foe. Death does seem to be this kind of unnatural intrusion into the story, at least in a particular kind of way, right? Many passages kind of reflect this. So we think about the Genesis 2:17 verse, when you eat of this fruit you will surely die, or perhaps the teaching of Romans 5:12, where there's this connection between sin and death that emerges. Now, it's not relevant for my purposes here tonight to take a position on the theological debate as to what was the nature of death before the fall and before sin entered into the world, and whether the entrance of sin changed the nature of death that was already here in some form. Regardless of whatever judgments we make on these matters, I think we have to acknowledge that the Christian tradition does seem to bring together this link between sin and death in some way, right, that we have to wrestle with and think about. So in light of this teaching, this side of what some would call the new heavens, new earth, death is inevitable. There is a time to be born, and there is a time to die, as Ecclesiastes tells us. Also, for Christians, death is said not to be final. So we think about something like 1 Corinthians 15:21. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. And this, as we know, according to some Christian tradition, is the great hope, right, that those who are believers, those who are the faithful have. The last enemy, which is death, is swallowed up in life, or so the biblical language often speaks. So the practical import here is that in light of this, we can see that a pure vitalism, as described earlier, is to be rejected. The Christian hope longs for this glorified body, to embrace this life as the summum bonum, or the highest good, is something to be hung on to at all costs, can easily slide into a form of idolatry. And so we have to be on guard and careful about this. So this first kind of point here, this dynamic of death is both friend and foe. An enemy, yes, but a defeated enemy. Second, this idea that suffering is a challenge to persevere through and an opportunity to overcome. On one hand, the Bible speaks of suffering as producing something of value in the lives of human beings. Romans 5. Right? Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So I want to say, though, very quickly, one who's done some work in hospice, that this idea here should never be an excuse not to do all that we can within ethical parameters to help with suffering that comes from physical pain and disease. I think the point with respect to the biblical teaching is that when we suffer, we are to do so with the hope that comes with having the joy of the Lord, so to speak, right? This kind of character development. And while there's a tension here, both of these things, I think, can work hand in hand here. We also have to be very careful that those who work in palliative care, when we think about the aims of palliative care, that we are careful not to identify the aims as just alleviating human suffering that comes with illness. I think palliative care is primarily about compassionate care, suffering with individuals, walking alongside individuals. And I and many others kind of worry that the language of solely focusing on alleviating suffering can actually lead to certain practices that may not be as beneficial in terms of providing care for those who are dying. So there is this opportunity to overcome with respect to suffering as well. We think about the healing ministry of Jesus. Beyond identifying Jesus as in certain high Christologies, right, as the divine Son of God, there's also this expression of Jesus as one who brings forth mercy and love to people who are undergoing the trials of physical pain and illness. And so this second theological point, I think, helps us to identify the balance between two extremes. The first extreme is to think of suffering as an unqualified evil that must be eradicated at all costs, even if that means employing something like euthanasia to alleviate the suffering. The other extreme is a too rigid acceptance of suffering that leads to unnecessarily prolonging death and the experience of suffering. This tension is certainly consistent with the primary claim behind the sanctity of life principle, which holds that human life is inherently valuable as a basic good and must never be taken intentionally, but it need not be preserved at all cost in the face of death. Third, we live in the tension of divine providence and human stewardship. We live in the tension of divine providence and human stewardship. Scripture, this biblical story, gives us this idea that God is preserving and guiding the created order to its end and to its fulfillment. So in a real sense, we can say that, according to some traditions, that God is in control, right? Even though the details of that have often occupied the attention and time of many philosophical theologians and systematic theologians. Though in an equally real sense, we can say that human beings make real decisions and have been given faculties not only to make decisions, but also to be stewards of the resources of the earth for the common good. And so medicine and its proper use is just one such expression of this, as some would say, cultural mandate or just stewardship, whatever the case may be. So there's this tension between divine providence, where we are relying and trying to figure out and maybe can't figure out what God is doing when illness hits us and how it sometimes disintegrates our lives, but also with the need to make real decisions. And in many cases, we're forced to make decisions, and not making a decision often is a decision of a particular sort. So I just want to share with you this, and I think a medical doctor who's also part of Christian tradition, or is a Christian, and a nurse who's also a Christian write these words I think aptly captures this tension here. They write, "Dying is a process. Sometimes this process happens quickly, but more often in today's era of intensive medical care, dying happens slowly. When we consider the use of ventilator support to help a person breathe, dialysis to replace failed kidneys, transfusion to replace blood loss, antibiotics to replace infections, CPR to try to reverse cardiac arrest, we see that the timing of death can involve an element of choice. Whether a patient dies in a few minutes or a few hours or a few days or a few weeks is often determined by a choice about whether to start, continue, or stop one or more of these treatments." And so I think this is part of the reason why we have to be careful when we have to make difficult decisions at the end of life, saying that we are playing God, right? Oftentimes I've run into this with families that we've worked with in very difficult circumstances and situations, and when maybe the care team and others from the community are communicating with the family in a way that it's probably time to make some more difficult decisions, because people don't want to confront those deeply troubling challenges, they will often appeal to God and say, well, we don't want to play God by making this particular decision. And so there's that tension there. So yes, there are perhaps lines we could cross with regard to medical technology and so on and so forth, where properly understood, maybe one could think about this idea of trying to play God. But the reality is that we've been given certain freedoms and faculties to make choices and decisions about these very complex and difficult matters. So this is one of the reasons why when you think about this balance, this tension, right, between these three theological categories here, the death, both friend and foe, suffering as a challenge to persevere through, an opportunity to overcome, and this idea of living between the tension of divine providence and human stewardship. One of the reasons why I think that some of these extremes of kind of what some would consider euthanasia may be problematic on one hand, but then also medical vitalism is problematic on the other hand. And so what are some of the options that we have in thinking about treatment at the end of life with respect to the sanctity of life principle? So here, let me just highlight 6 kind of options that sometimes emerge on this spectrum in palliative care and hospice work that I think can be informed theologically as well. The first is this idea of removal of aggressive life support. Second, the use of aggressive opioids and sedatives. So, for example, morphine is one example of this. This is a drug that is often used to help manage and treat pain at the end of life. Another technique called palliative sedation. How many of you here are familiar with palliative sedation? Have you heard this before? No? Okay. So palliative sedation is kind of a process where you're given very strong sedatives to really dissociate a person from the conscious experience of pain. So if you are having trouble managing pain of someone who has, say, some very aggressive forms of cancer, and all the other regimens that you've tried, all the other medications that you've used is just not working, where the person is still terribly uncomfortable and experiencing significant pain, then you can give medications that, in the proper framework and context, that can basically make someone unconscious, that dissociates them with the conscious experience of the pain that they're experiencing. This idea of voluntary stopping eating and drinking, this is also something that emerges on the spectrum of palliative care options. Now, this is challenging. One has to be careful in thinking about this, especially when it is combined with other types of practices. Some have advocated that we should always continue, feeding, that that's a form of care, it's an expression of Christian love to do that. The problem is that if we're talking about these options kind of at the end of life, when a person is clearly on the trajectory of dying, and maybe they're in that either active phase of dying or kind of transitioning in some ways, this actually becomes more burdensome and problematic for people because as the body is changing, they're not able to metabolize food. It's kind of like those meals where you have family gatherings where you have that aunt who wants you to get another piece of pie or something like that if you're already full. It's like, I can't eat anymore, right? It's like, while it's good to eat and have this kind of hospitality, it actually can become problematic. Where it's more controversial is when it's not clear if the person could still tolerate or metabolize kind of food and water and so on and so forth. And so is this something that is kind of, some would say, causing the death of the patient? Or some might ask, is this hastening the death of the patient? And I do want to make a distinction between acts that maybe affect the timing of the death of someone in terms of like hastening and something that actually kind of causes the death of a person. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later if you're curious or interested. This notion of physician-assisted suicide, some say physician-assisted death. Again, this is a practice where let me just give you the definition given by Daniel Callahan here. It's the act of killing oneself by means of lethal drugs provided by a physician or some other healthcare personnel, usually for the purposes of doing good or expressing compassion towards someone or trying to maintain an element of personal choice for a person to be able to determine how she or he dies. So this idea of physician-assisted suicide. And then euthanasia is the direct killing of a patient by a doctor or some other healthcare personnel, ordinarily by means of a lethal injection or some other kind of lethal agent, okay? So again, various forms of euthanasia, but just trying to capture the essence of kind of what this practice is. And so these are the 6 kind of, there are others, but these are kind of the primary options. Some would say extraordinary palliative care options at the end of life. And so if you think about these extremes of maybe euthanasia on one hand, medical vitalism on the other hand, this big Q, capital Q, quality of life, what are some options that can range across this spectrum to help us value life at the end of life while also maintaining certain theological commitments as well. All right. Now, removal of aggressive life support, I think this can be compatible with the sanctity of life principle, the kind of Christian ethic that I'm thinking about here. use of aggressive opioids and sedatives, morphine, I think, again, this can be compatible. Palliative sedation also, as well as voluntary stopping, eating, and drinking. Now, each of these, as I list them, are somewhat kind of abstract, right? The reality is that when you think about these practices within a particular context, within the particular situation, then the details do matter. We often say in kind of the world of ethics that many moral judgments often turn on non-moral facts, right? So the moral judgment that we make about the appropriateness of some of these options often depends on the non-moral facts or the context of the situation in which these options might be applied. So what I want to do here is just kind of use this and keep this as kind of background for a little bit, keep this in our mind, kind of come back and look at criticisms of the sanctity or the inviolability of life view. One of the reasons is because there are many people who wrestle with these issues, at least conceptually, when you start thinking about them, the people who do ethics work with regard to end of life, some philosophers and theologians as well who are wrestling with the conceptual issues are thinking about this, because there are some who say that each of these 6 options are just all part of the same cloth, right? So that if you embrace any one of them, if you think that it could be morally appropriate at the end of life, you should embrace all of them. If you have any problems or misgiving with any one of them, then you should also have some moral problems with all of them, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's important, and there are some very interesting arguments that are developed to kind of show this continuity with regard to these various options. And so for those who want to make certain distinctions, like myself, many others as well, but myself, as I think about these issues from the perspective of theological ethics, as well as kind of religious moral philosophy, I think that we have to make some distinctions between some of these practices where I think 4 out of those 6 would fit within the framework that I'm thinking about here. Now, again, I want to be very clear that many folks who are working within the Christian tradition thinking about these issues may not agree, right, with my claim about physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia as being in tension with some of these theological resources. There are some who are trying to make theological arguments to say that we should more readily embrace these various practices. So criticisms of the sanctity or the inviolability of life view, this kind of way that's supposed to be kind of between the extremes of vitalism and quality of life view. Helga Kusay, a very famous philosopher, made kind of a sustained philosophical argument against this idea of the sanctity of life. And so let me just try to read a couple of lines from her, or a few lines from some of her work, and then try to summarize her concern with the sanctity of life view when it comes to medicine and end-of-life care. So Helga Kusay writes, many of those in the medical profession who profess to subscribe to the sanctity of life doctrine appear not to practice what the doctrine preaches. Each year, thousands of handicapped infants are allowed to die. Terminally ill patients do not have their lives prolonged by all possible means, and the life support of irreversibly comatose patients is withdrawn in the clear expectation that death will often follow within minutes. But if such lives as these could be prolonged by readily available means, and a decision is taken against prolonging them, then we appear to be confronted with practices that do not treat all lives as equally valuable or inviolable, okay? You see what she's getting at here? She's suggesting that, as you withdraw life-sustaining treatment, you may call it allowing to die, but that action, right, itself is causing the death. You're precipitating or hastening or affecting the timing of the death of a patient. And so how does this fit with the sanctity of life? And so again, she would advocate pushing this idea that the sanctity of life view is really just medical vitalism, right? In other words, she's kind of pushing us to, in some ways, just kind of own it, right? So these 2 alleged inconsistencies of the sanctity of life principle she's getting at here, the first is something like this: in holding that is in some circumstances permissible to refrain from preventing death, advocates of this view infringe the previously accepted principle, which holds that it is always absolutely prohibited intentionally to terminate human life. refraining from preventing death is an instance of the intentional termination of life. That's her claim, right? So this is where many folks who would kind of disagree with her framing of it would want to really push back at that particular claim there. Secondly, advocates of the view affirm the equality of all human lives and yet base their arguments for a limited duty of life preservation on implicit quality of life considerations. So this is where I was going back earlier, this idea of the capital Q, quality of life, that makes a judgment about individuals, about people, say that these lives aren't, or lives like this really aren't worth living. And so it's maybe morally permissible if that's what the person wants to do, to end or terminate that life. And so those who say they want to hold to the sanctity of life principle may want to reject this capital Q quality of life, but then Helga Kusay and many, many others, right, would say, but wait a minute, how does this work? Because if you think that it's okay at some point to terminate or to stop life-sustaining treatment, right, or to say that enough is enough, aren't you involved in the exact same thing here, right? And so you're making a quality of life consideration. You're thinking about, well, is life worth living in this condition, to make the decision to cease life-sustaining treatment or not to start it altogether. And so what do we do with this? How do we think about this issue here? And so the question is, does the sanctity of life view lead to medical vitalism despite its claim not to? And again, I'm speaking primarily in terms of end-of-life care as a framework of thinking about decisions that we make with regard to the various options that are available to us. Now, my short answer to this question, as you might imagine by now, is no. Hopefully, I think we can see why and when we consider a couple of just distinctions, and then I'll give you a couple of quotes and we can open up for some conversations here. So the first, I think, is this idea of intention, right? Some people may want to say the intention foreseen distinction that sometimes is affiliated with what's called like double effect reasoning. Another way you can think about it is just different ways of thinking about the notion of intention, right? So when someone intends to do something, there's a reason for the action, right? Or for the act, I want to say. There's reason for the act. And there's this another sense of intention, this kind of wider sense of intention that is often used, and what people sometimes mean by that is this awareness of many possible outcomes of the action, right? And so Tom Scanlon, in his book Moral Dimensions, he, I think, makes a very helpful distinction between narrow and wider senses of intention. And I think what's relevant for our thinking about these issues, right, with respect to the sanctity of life, is this intention on this idea of the reason or reasons for acting, and making sure that that can be clear, and that we can ask certain questions in community together to kind of get at what our actual intentions might be. So the sanctity and inviolability of life holds that intentional taking of human life, whether done by act or omission, regardless of the motive or the reason, is morally problematic, okay? Again, people may disagree on this, but historically this is how the idea has been developed in end-of-life care. And so, as John Keown notes, that the sanctity of life accepts that conduct which foreseeably shortens life is not always wrong. So that there are instances in which life-sustaining treatments are stopped with no intention of ending life of the patient, though death may be a foreseen consequence of the action. So one in this kind of framing is not morally culpable for the death, and the choice to cease life-sustaining treatment should not be seen as killing, but allowing the patient to die. Now, for those who may be acquainted with the philosophical arguments that undergird this, this is not an appeal to like what's called bare difference arguments between killing and letting die, right? Where killing is always wrong and letting die is not, right? I think that the issues are much more kind of complex and complicated than making that kind of bare distinction, so that's not what's going on here. Many have suggested that this is a conceptually untenable, this kind of distinction here, and perhaps even if it is conceptually helpful, it may not be morally relevant to helping us think about these issues. Yet I think that this idea of intention is going to be central to a consistent application of the sanctity of life principle, at least as I am conceiving of it here. And also I think with the practice of medicine in general, that something like intention is very, very important for thinking about the ethical life. I do think the basic notion of the distinction and the centrality of intention in moral assessment can be captured intuitively, even if we haven't worked out all the issues with like philosophy of action, right? I mean, you think about somebody, a blind person who maybe steps on your foot, right? You may be forgiving even though you may be sore. That's different from someone who has their sight and looks at your foot, looks at you in the eye, and then steps on your foot deliberately and continues to walk out, right? I think our moral response would be somewhat different, right? And rightfully so, I think. And so it does seem evident that you can have the exact same consequences, say, of an event, and yet you can have diverging moral assessments based on this notion of intention. And again, the claim is not that it's always easy to identify. The claim is not that we're always clear as to maybe what our intentions are and so on and so forth. But yet I think in many respects it's still going to be very difficult to just do without it altogether. And so, so let me just get to this by thinking about these various options, give you a summative quote by Margaret Somerville in her work, The Ethical Canary. She writes, refusals of treatment, including of life support treatment and artificial hydration and nutrition, and the provision of necessary pain relief treatment or treatments for other systems of serious physical distress she wants to claim are not euthanasia. And with her on these points, I agree. Even if these actions, she writes, shorten life. In respecting refusals of treatment, the primary intention is to respect the person's right to inviolability, the right not to be touched, including by treatment without one's consent. In giving pain relief treatment, the primary intention is to relieve pain, not to inflict death. In euthanasia, the primary intention is to inflict death in order to relieve pain and suffering. It is this primary intention that makes euthanasia unacceptable to those who oppose it, she writes. A second distinction here, quickly, is this distinction between the worthwhileness of treatments versus the worthwhileness of the patient. And here again, I'm following John Keown in his work on this. And this is interesting, right? And it's challenging in some ways because, again, not all would agree that this distinction matters in the way that Keown, and I would say that I would want to argue that it does. So for the sake of time, let me just quote Keown on this. And so he writes, a treatment may not be worthwhile either because it offers no reasonable hope of benefit or because even though it does, the expected benefit would be outweighed by burdens which the treatment would impose, such as excessive pain. Notice, however, that the question is always whether the treatment would be worthwhile, not whether the patient's life would be worthwhile. Were one to engage in judgments of this latter sort and to conclude that certain lives were not worth living, one would forfeit any principled basis for objection to intentional killing. Right? It's the way he's trying to push back on Helga Cuset's way of thinking, and many others kind of following this line of thought. And so it is within these parameters, I think, that it is appropriate to employ, some would say, qualified quality of life language. This could be considered the distinction between the kind of capital Q, quality of life of considerations, as a school of thought concerning the value of human life, and this kind of lowercase q, quality of life considerations that focus on the benefits and the burdens of a particular treatment. Often in a medical context, many who hold to the inviolability of life do make appeal to this kind of lowercase quality of life considerations. But the quality of life considerations they are making are aimed not at the person, but the treatment, right? Will this treatment have the desired effect? And so as Keown says, this big Q, quality of life judgments, purport to judge the worthwhileness of the patient's life. The inviolability doctrine opposes such attempts and merely takes the patient's condition into account in deciding on the worthwhileness of a proposed treatment. For in order to decide whether a proposed treatment will be worthwhile, excuse me, one must first ascertain the patient's present condition and consider whether and to what extent it will be improved by the proposed treatment. The exercise is often described as involving an assessment of the patient's kind of lowercase or little q, quality of life now and as it would be after the treatment, okay? And so this distinction, if it holds, right, is often confused in medical and ethical discourse. And this does cause some problems in terms of communication and assessing the reasons behind certain decisions at the end of life. But the language is pretty firmly entrenched in kind of our medical discourse, such that we need to be clear as to what we and perhaps others mean when this language comes up, this quality of life language. It must be kept in mind that all human life, theologically speaking, I want to say, is a basic good, not an ultimate or an absolute one, while all human life, no matter the condition, is of value to God. And I want to say for those who adhere to the broad aspects of Christian tradition should also be to us. There are other goods that serve as the basis for human flourishing, such as friendship, knowledge, the experience of beauty, worship of God, and so forth. And there does come a point to where human beings may decide that the continuing of life-sustaining treatment cannot improve their kind of lowercase quality of life, and they can choose to cease it. Or they can forego this, aggressive chemotherapy and so on and so forth. As one Christian ethicist put it, although human life is a basic good, it is not the highest good, to which all other basic goods must be sacrificed in order to ensure its preservation. The core doctrine of the sanctity of life is the principle which prohibits intentional killing. The principle does not require the preservation of life, at all costs. And so, given the inevitability of death and the great Christian hope, I think we should recognize that we ought not to cling to this life as if it were the summum bonum or the highest good. It is not always easy to determine when and what to do in any given situation. It requires wisdom and community, and we should also take care not to judge harshly those who may make decisions that may be different from what we would do. Nevertheless, there is a time to die. Of course, our loved ones' deaths aren't always deemed to be precious in our sight, but the psalmist says in Psalm 116:15 that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. And so this question, does the sanctity of life require vitalism? When we understand the nuances of the sanctity of life view, and if the distinctions are legitimate, then I want to suggest to us that the answer is no. And a couple concluding points here, and we'll kind of open this up. This way of wisdom. Let me just close with this statement given to us by let me do one other, or two others here. So Dennis Hollinger, who's a Christian ethicist, done a lot of work on this issue, former colleague of mine. He writes in one of his books this statement here that I think is very interesting and important. He writes, because issues can be complex, some of our decisions may involve choosing the wise course of action rather than absolute moral good. This is certainly not always the case, for even in the midst of complexity, we are often able to discern clear directions. However, we must be open to the fact that in regard to some ethical judgments, our focus will be more on the wise, judicious course of action than the one absolute right course of action. And the reality is that we do this in community as we develop character here. Kyle Felder makes this note here: the development of Christian character is absolutely central to the Christian life. To be a Christian is to be shaped by the values, commitments, and worldview of the community of faith to such a degree that one begins to internalize certain virtues and dispositions. While belief and action are vital to being a Christian, one must also allow oneself to be shaped and molded into a particular kind of person to develop a set of virtues that reflect what we as Christians claim to believe about the world. And so this idea of doing ethics is a communal exercise. We need not make these difficult decisions in isolation. We grow in Christian character with the community of believers. And I think as we embody Christian practices and do life together and wrestle with these issues, I think at least my hope and prayer for various communities of faith, that we can affirm the words of Dr. Robert Fine, who's Director of Clinical Ethics and Palliative Care at the Baylor Healthcare System in the United States, when he says, but even greater improvement is possible when we all accept that sooner or later, mortality is not a medical problem to be solved, but a spiritual problem to be faced. When we learn to number our days spiritually, then we may gain the psalmist's heart of wisdom. A physician with such a heart may better distinguish between treatments that prolong dying versus those that restore health. A patient with a heart of wisdom may better accept a lesson from Ecclesiastes that there is a time to die, to stop running from death. Finally, families who have gained a heart of wisdom may better accept that loving enough to let go is the highest love that they can bestow on the dying. Thank you.